Thank you, Madam President. I rise to explain my vote.
Proceed.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I am voting in favor of this bill. It's not because I believe that we need major reforms in charter schools. I think we have continued to make reforms over the years, reforms that actually were solving problems and not simply, I think, playing to a narrative that has been built up. And I want to say, before I proceed with my comments, that I appreciate my colleague, Senator Brophy McGee. She has listened to a lot of different sides, and she has come up with a bill that I think she has put a lot of time and effort, and she has thought through the issues that exist, and as she has garnered more information, she has crafted something that I think she believes will help the charter school system without overburdening. With that said, I don't think this bill is necessary because I don't think that there are major broken issues with charter schools, notwithstanding the prolific writing of certain reporters. And for now, I'll leave it at that. But what I want to do, Madam President and members, is I want to give the side of the story that rarely makes it in, if ever, into the media. And that's the side that says charter schools are doing exactly what they were intended to do. It doesn't mean that there aren't bad players, just like in district schools there are bad players. We had an issue with procurement with the Scottsdale School District. That doesn't mean all district schools are bad or all district schools are breaking the law. We have bad players, and that's because there are people who do bad things, not because the system is bad. But what I want to do is give a history, just as briefly as I can, but there is some history here that I would like you to know. So I'm going to go through the statutes because it has been reported by the media that somehow I have passed laws that are benefiting me and somehow creating the opportunity for me to run a for-profit, which I no longer am involved in. But I want to set the record straight, and this seems like a good opportunity to do so. So I want to take directly out of the statutes. Now, no one has ever said that I am corrupt, but they certainly have intimated that I am corrupt based on the statutes. Well, let me read to you statutes that were passed years and years before I was ever elected to the legislature. So when I read these, understand, I had nothing to do with, I didn't vote on these. This was at least 6, 7 years before I ever ran for the legislature. But this is the foundation of the reporting that somehow charter schools are corrupt, and certainly I'm corrupt because I'm a legislator and I voted on laws, even though they weren't these laws. So I want to run through some of these. And just so you know, I've presented this to different media outlets, and they continue to ignore them because they don't fit into their narrative. So you can follow along if you'd like to. These are all statutes, and I'm probably going to read about a half a dozen and then discuss them. The first one is 15183B. And the reporter behind me doesn't have to write this down because I've given this to him many times. But again, he's decided to ignore them all and to write what he wants because it fits his narrative, not the truth. 15183B, the sponsor of a charter school, that means the government, may contract with a public body, meaning government, a private person or private organization for the purpose of establishing a charter school pursuant to this article. Now that means that the legislature back in 1994 when this was passed intended this to be for private companies and even for profits. And why do I know that? Because a private person cannot be a nonprofit. They intentionally put in there private organization and private person. So they intended this to be both private nonprofits and private for-profits. That's not an accident. That's not a loophole. That was intentional. 15183E5. The charter of a charter school shall do all the following, and then 5 is ensure that, except as provided in this article and in its charter, meaning the contract, it is exempt from all statutes and rules relating to schools, governing boards, and school districts. The legislature back in 1994 never intended charter schools to be government entities or government schools. And they didn't intend them to operate as such. They intended them to be in the private sector contracting with the state. So we know that charter schools are contractors because of the first statute that I read, and we know that they intended them not to be subject to the same government regulation because they're not government entities. In 115-185b6, the charter school shall not charge tuition for pupils who reside in the state, levy taxes, or issue bonds. Prohibition on taxing. Why is that? Because charter schools were never intended to be government entities. 15183T, all property accumulated by a charter school shall remain the property of the charter school. That's pretty clear. Charter schools aren't absconding with property. They're private companies, and the statute back in 1994-95 gave them very clearly the ownership of any property. Why is that? Because they're private companies, they take personal risks, they take personal loans, they sign personal guarantees. They are private contractors contracting with the state. That's what that says. Charter schools own the property. I didn't do that. Long before I was ever in the legislature, that was passed. 15183S, charter schools may pledge, assign, or encumber their assets to be used as collateral for loans or extensions of credit. Now, why is that? Because the legislature gave charter schools, made it very clear that they are private, they can be for-profit, they own all the assets, and they can use it to go out into the private market and buy facilities or other goods that they need to contract and fulfill the obligations they have with the state. Now, here's the clincher, and this is the thing that, again, gets distorted in the media because they don't care about the truth. 15183P, and this is very, very important. Charter school sponsors and this state are not liable for the debts or financial obligations of a charter school or persons who operate charter schools. The state has no liability for the charter schools. Zero. If a charter school defaults, the state doesn't have to pay for the buildings. The corporation that contracted with some private company to loan them the money has to pay those off. The state has zero obligation. And in fact, we pay in arrears, so even the monthly payment to a charter school based on performance is after the performance. The state has zero risk with charter schools. Zero. The risk is all upon the charter school operator and their families. Now remember, all of these statutes were passed long before I was ever here. Now, I'm guessing that might surprise some of you because you've read the stories about how Eddie Farnsworth passed laws to enrich himself. Poppycock. Didn't happen. You can go and look these up. They're in the statutes. That's what we do. Well, what about the reports by these so-called nonpartisan groups like the Grand Canyon Institute? You mean the Grand Canyon Institute that said after an amendment was killed last year in the House where it would have created a conflict of laws, etc., it was horribly written, and they said now it means that charter schools can take bribes? You mean that nonpartisan group? First of all, they're not nonpartisan, just so you know. The director of that was a district school administrator who hates charter schools, but that's an aside. So don't believe that at all. I guess they forgot to read 132605 that says it's commercial bribery is up to a class 5 felony. Charter schools cannot take bribes, nor can any other corporation. These are corporations that are under Title 10. So when you look at the bill that's before us, the attempt, which again, I commend Senator Brophy McGee, but the bill before us attempts to recodify what charter schools already have to do because they are subject to Title 10, the corporate statutes. The corporate board has to act in the fiduciary of the corporation. They have to, under statute. That includes procurement. You can't procure for your own benefit at the cost of the corporation. That is already illegal. But you won't read that anywhere because it doesn't fit the narrative. In fact, the general standards of conduct for directors under 10.830, directors shall act in good faith, act with ordinary care of a prudent person, and in the best interest of the corporation. The corporation owns the charter school. Therefore, anything that is procured or decided on behalf of the charter school falls under the scope of this statute and the obligation to fulfill their fiduciary in looking after the corporation. What about the disclosure to corporate officers? Corporate board, if there is a conflict or if there is a close relationship and you want to do business with a related entity? Already in statute, already in Title 10. You have to disclose, if you're on a corporate board, you have to disclose to the other corporate board and recuse yourself. They can vote if they choose, if you convince them that a related entity contract is in the best interest of the corporation, the corporate board can vote to do that. But it's after disclosure. That's already in statute. So, we need more transparency. Please explain to me how the reporters can report on the information that they have reported if they don't have transparency. Please explain that to me. Charter schools have to give financial audits to the state every year. They have performance audits. They are audited like you wouldn't believe. There is transparency like you wouldn't believe. That's why the reports are out there. Nobody's trying to hide anything. And yet if you read the papers, charter schools are all trying to hide everything. Again, poppycock. It's not true. In fact, it is absolutely flat out incorrect. So, I would ask you, as I look at this, I see the movement. I'm not talking about the people within this body. I'm talking about those on the outside that are trying to push charter school reform, so-called charter school reform. They're not trying to push a reform for everyone who gets taxpayer money, because if they did that, guess what? All of us would have to disclose, because where does your check come from? Taxpayers. Yeah, that was rhetorical, but thank you, Mr. Livingston. He is correct. It's taxpayer money. What about, and I won't even talk about those that are outside of education, but we have a narrative that is selective hypocrisy. Who do you think sells buses to schools? Private, for-profit companies, and they make millions of dollars. Who do you think sells books and curricula to schools? For-profit companies, and they make millions of dollars. Who do you think builds charter schools? For-profit companies, and they make millions of dollars. Who do you think sells desks? Who do you think comes in and is the psychologist? Who do you think comes in with medical help? The list goes on and on and on and on and on. But the selective hypocrisy says, but if you're a charter school, it's bad. For everybody else, it's okay. In fact, GCU did the exact same thing that I did, converting from a for-profit to a nonprofit, and they were lauded as being great, and I was beat up as being a criminal. Selective hypocrisy. If we really believe that the nexus between taxpayer money and services means that that money continues to be public money, then we need to not have this bill. We need a bill that says anyone and everyone who receives a tax dollar is responsible for open meeting laws, is responsible for disclosure on how they spend it, is responsible for procurement laws, is responsible for the fiduciary that corporations have. We should be doing that for everyone. But we're not. We're not even doing it for ourselves. So, what truth is there in these papers? There's some truth, very little, but some. I would tell you the truth is that there are a lot of charter school operators that have been very successful. myself included. I ran a charter school for 23 years before I decided to convert it to a nonprofit. It was consistently in the top 10 to 15% in academic performance. Fiscally very responsible, operated with a cash reserve, which I guess I'm vilified for having a cash reserve, but if I didn't have a cash reserve and I couldn't pay bills because of that, I would have been vilified for being an irresponsible businessman. So what's the purpose here? I hear people say, I support charter schools, as long as they live up to everything that the district schools have to live up to.
Senator Farnsworth, go ahead and continue, but let's wrap it up shortly, I guess.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Madam President, where in the rules is it that I have a limit on time?
I don't believe there is any limit.
Okay, thank you. Madam President, I think that the scope of this bill covers what I'm talking about, so I would ask that you rule whether I am out of order or not.
Senator Farnsworth, no, you are not out of order.
Thank you, Madam President. And I will wrap this up. I'm getting to the end. Thank you very much. But this is important because this is a narrative that is going after good people. I know an auditor of a charter school that had a complaint filed because, guess what, the media didn't like what he was doing. Good man, may have destroyed his livelihood. It's disgusting. It's vile. Madam President, members, so what's this about? This is about a narrative to make charter schools government schools. That's not what they were intended to be. I read the laws to you that were put into place in 1994, some cleanup in 95 and 96, long before I was ever here. Charter schools are not a problem. Charter schools are operating exactly the way they are supposed to be operating, with some not being as successful as others, and there's a mechanism to close them down. So, Madam President, this anti-charter school movement is just that. It's an anti-charter school movement. We need to be very cautious in essentially hamstringing or destroying a process that has worked for nearly a quarter of a century with very successful schools. And instead of vilifying them, we ought to be saying, you guys are doing a good job. So, Madam President, I make no apologies for being successful, notwithstanding the information that's been put out against me that is very selective to try to paint a narrative. I make no apologies. I'm grateful to the sponsor. I am voting yes because I committed to her and to others. Let's have a look at this. No one's trying to hide this. I've not asked anybody to vote against it. I've not lobbied against this. I'm voting for it. Let's get it to the House. Let's see what happens over in the House. But members, you need to know the rest of the story. That's the rest of the story. There's plenty more, but for the sake of time and in deference to your patience, I will wrap it up, and I vote aye.
Thank you, sir.